So, having looked at how liberalism and nationalism increased political tensions, or how they, I guess, played upon British political developments in the late 19th century, we're now going to look at the same thing in France. And when we last left France, it was during the Revolution of 1848, where the French King Louis Philippe had been overthrown and a second French Republic had been declared. And at the very end of that year, if you remember the guy pictured here, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, had run for president and had won the office in a big upset. At the time, a lot of people were concerned about whether Louis Napoleon would try and basically follow in his uncle's example and to make himself emperor. And as it turns out, those people were completely correct to have these fears. Over the course of most of his political reign, Louis Napoleon had tried to have his term in office extended. The French Constitution of 1848 said the president could only sit in office for one 4-year term. He tried to have this changed. The rest of the government refused to grant this. So in 1851, Louis Napoleon staged a coup against his own government with military support, and in 1852 formally proclaimed himself Emperor of France and took the title Napoleon III. Now, if you're wondering where Napoleon II went, that was in reference to Napoleon's son, who had died in the 1830s. So Louis Napoleon made himself Napoleon III, Emperor of France, and this period during French history is known as the Second Empire. So what's remarkable about Louis Napoleon's reign is that, on the one hand, he had to appeal to conservative interests in order to maintain his hold on power. So he sought to win the support of Catholics, for example, and the main thing he did for Catholics was defending the Pope in Rome, who was under threat from Italian revolutionaries. He worked with monarchists, big business owners, big businessmen, who wanted political stability and economic prosperity. But he also introduced liberal reforms. So Louis Napoleon wanted the people to like him, basically. And he wanted to appeal to France's revolutionary history or at least present himself as a continuation of that at the same time. So he did introduce some liberal reforms. One obvious example was the Second Republic had introduced universal male suffrage, but during the course of Louis Napoleon's reign as president, not of his idea, but the government had rolled back the franchise, had reduced it to about 80% of the male population. Louis Napoleon restored universal male suffrage once he became emperor. And there was elections held every 6 years for the National Parliament of France. The only problem was that you had to have government permission in order to run for parliament. So really, even though all men had to vote, they didn't really have any say or influence on government. Louis Napoleon also introduced liberal economic reforms, and I think I mentioned in an earlier class that liberal political reforms and liberal economic reforms went hand in hand in the 19th century. This in particular meant encouraging free trade. He signed a free trade treaty with the United Kingdom in 1860. He encouraged the development of French banks in order to promote investment. And the result was the French economy, especially in the 1850s, did very, very well during Louis Napoleon's reign. French exports doubled over the course of the 1850s. And French investors made so much money that they had to start to look overseas in order to invest their money for profitable gain. And France became one of the leading nations in the world for international investment during Louis Napoleon's reign as well. By the 1860s, and after Louis Napoleon's hold on power had stabilized, that is to say that because the economy was doing well, more and more people began to accept the fact that he had overthrown the Second Republic, he was able to tweak the political system to introduce more liberal reforms. So he relaxed censorship of the press in 1861. He allowed for more open debate in Parliament, and actually more importantly, in the mid-1860s, he allowed critics or people who didn't necessarily approve of him to run for Parliament, and that they could speak out against him in Parliament. He also allowed French workers to, or given the right to go on strike in 1864. And what Louis Napoleon was hoping was that these liberal reforms would kind of mute the criticism of the fact that he was an emperor who kind of held most of the power in his own hands. This is not what actually happened. In reality, that the critics of the Second Empire took advantage of Louis Napoleon's liberal reforms to demand further reforms and increase the pressure on him. And by the end of the 1860s, there was a lot of people calling for real liberal reforms where people's votes would actually really count towards something and would be able to have some kind of say and influence on the French government. Of course, all of this came to a crashing end in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, when France was defeated comprehensively by Prussia. Napoleon III was captured in battle. He was captured at the Battle of Sedan in 1870, and the French government back in Paris immediately declared that he had been overthrown and proclaimed a third republic. So the war did not end when Louis Napoleon was captured. The city of Paris, led by the government of the Third Republic, refused to surrender. It was surrounded by the Prussian army. And Paris was put under siege for 4 months in the fall of 1870 into the early 1871. The people of Paris suffered horribly. Eventually, the Prussian government began using artillery to try and suppress the Parisian resistance. And in February 1871, the Prussian government allowed the French hold elections to elect a government that would negotiate France's surrender. So in Paris in particular, the Parisians felt the brunt of some of these the surrender terms. Firstly, the Prussians were allowed to have a victory march through Paris. The new German Empire was proclaimed at the Hall of Versailles, just outside Paris as well. The French army, or the German army, would not leave France until the bill essentially the French German army gave the French state the bill of the war and said, we're not going to leave until you pay off the bill. And the Germans annexed Alsace-Lorraine, which were two provinces on the border between France and Germany. These were to remain a big sticking point in French attitudes towards Germany. They felt that France would not be avenged this war until Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France. The Republican politician Leon Gambetta famously said, "Never speak of them, think of them always." In other words, the French really wanted to get Alsace-Lorraine back. And the Franco-Prussian War was a demoralizing defeat for the French, not just because they lost the war, but suddenly there was a new country, Germany, which was bigger in terms of population, which had a much stronger economy, which had a much better military, and had totally undermined France's position as the dominant power on continental Europe, which had dated back for centuries. So the Third Republic was proclaimed on the fall of Louis Napoleon. As one student remembered, Louis Napoleon III or IV, so this person obviously wasn't sure which Napoleon, said he put down both numbers, mounted the French throne, not how you spell throne. One thinks of Napoleon III as a live extension of the late but great Napoleon. The Third Republic. Well, the Third Republic was declared, but the people of Paris in particular felt a disconnect with the Third Republic. The government that was elected in the elections of February 1871 was pretty conservative, and many people in Paris felt that government essentially had betrayed Paris by allowing the Germans have a victory parade through Paris. Paris itself had been defended during the Franco-Prussian War, during the siege, by the National Guard. The National Guard were essentially the militia of Paris that was usually populated by the working classes. And they had felt betrayed as well. They had felt the rest of the country had not come to Paris's aid during this siege. And they had held on to the cannon they had used during the siege of Paris. In March 1871, the government of France, under a guy called Adolphe Thiers, Thiers, sent soldiers into Paris to recover the cannon, but the National Guard refused to hand them over. And effectively, Paris declared its independence from the rest of France. That the Paris Commune was established, that is working, or a collection of socialists, communists, various working class interests, took advantage of the power vacuum because the French army pulled back out of Paris to reorganize so it could retake Paris when it felt strong enough. And in this power vacuum, something called the Paris Commune emerged, a government of the workers for the workers. And the Paris Commune to this day has a very important legacy on French politics. Not surprisingly, it's remembered very fondly by people on the political left in particular. So what did the Paris Commune do during its 2 months of existence? It introduced a variety of measures to try and a variety of measures that were for the benefit of the ordinary working people of France. So they postponed debts that had been racked up during the war. They cancelled unpaid rents that had not been paid during the siege of Paris. They introduced shorter working hours. An obvious example of this, just to give one example, was they outlawed something called night baking. Night baking was where bakers were forced to work during the night in order to bake loaves of bread. Ordinary workers hated the night baking because if you were a baker doing this, you got very little sleep, so they outlawed night baking. They introduced nurseries to allow working women to drop their children off so they could go work during the day. And in general, they introduced a variety of laws to try and promote wellness and economic well-being of the workers. Another novel idea they had was to introduce free theatre performances for ordinary people as well. However, the French government had not given up on Paris. It was simply taking its time to build up its forces enough where they felt strong enough to take on the National Guard of Paris. And in May 1871, the French army returned. It surrounded Paris, and then the soldiers went in. And what followed was a week of slaughter as the National Guard and the workers of the Commune engaged in a mass fight with the soldiers. The end result was 20,000 people were left dead. Some of those who died during the Paris Commune were essentially were members of the National Guard who'd been captured by the soldiers and were executed without any trial or due process. So at 20,000 people dead, this was the single deadliest civil confrontation in anywhere in Europe during the 19th century. So Paris Commune was defeated. The Third Republic government under Thiers was now fully in control of France. But even though they were a Republican government, most of these members of the Parliament actually wanted to restore the French monarchy. Of course, the question is, if you're going to restore the French monarchy, who's going to be king? Because there were two royal houses in France that were both overthrown at different stages in the 19th century that have some claim. On the one hand, you have the old House of Bourbon, which had been overthrown in 1830 when Charles X was overthrown. His grandson, the Count de Chambord, was still alive. He's had a claim to the throne. The other claimant was a guy called the Count de Paris, who was the grandson of Louis Philippe, who had been overthrown from the House of Orleans in 1848. So if you want to restore the monarchy, the question is, which king are you going to pick? Interesting side note, the Count de Paris had actually served as a Union soldier during the American Civil War in 1871. He had been in the United States when war broke out and enlisted in the Union Army for a time. It seemed like the obvious solution would be to try and find some kind of compromise. And there was one possible compromise. The Count de Chambord was in his mid-50s. He didn't have any children, and a lot of people felt that he wasn't particularly of good health. So the idea became, why don't we make the Count de Chambord the King of France first, and he will then appoint the Count de Paris as his heir, and then everyone wins. And that was the obvious solution. That solution would have worked, except for one sticking point. The Count de Chambord was very, very stubborn and very determined to return to the French throne only on his terms, and he insisted that he would not become King of France unless the French tricolour was abandoned, and unless the old French monarchical flag, which was a white flag with the fleur-de-lis on it, was used instead. And the government understood that that would not be acceptable to the people of France. So in the short term, their plan became, well, Count de Chambord is old, let's just wait for him to die, and then we will just make the Count de Paris king instead. And had the Count de Chambord died in the early 1870s, that probably would have worked, but he clung on until 1883. So for 13 years, the Republic existed, and by the time he died, it had bedded in so much that there was very little demand to replace it. As Adolphe Thiers himself said, the Republic is the form of government that divides us least. And so almost by default, the Third Republic survived. And unlike the First and Second Republic, it was to survive for 70 years, and it didn't fall until the Second World War. So France, somewhat by default, becomes a republic once more after the fall of the Second Empire.